I was born just 24 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. But the atmosphere of the slave days was still strong at my place of birth, and the religious folk songs of my people were being born out of religious experience at white heat. It is the earnestness that lends to these songs their own nobility and their inescapable appeal. Humble they are in origin, form, and means. Rather symbolic, no? The term negro is a misnomer when taken to mean that in anything but color, the slaves were of one universal type. But for those Africans who were transplanted to the United States, the term Afra-american seems fitting. My pa, William Hayes, part Indian of Cherokee stock, according to his account. I believe he might have been born in Illinois, but it was from Missouri that he went south to Atlanta to find work. What a wonderful carpenter and craftsman he was in the flat woods, working magic with his tools. My pa met my mother on the road from Atlanta, carrying a document which showed him to be a free man. When I was a child, I drank in all the music I heard in the woods, in the fields, and at church, singing in school, or in our cabin at the feet of my father with our friend Jim Kirby. We called him Uncle Nat. You see, my father would imitate animal sounds. There was no sound in nature that he could not imitate. He taught me to identify the songs of birds, repeating and answering their melodies. It was as if my father that taught me that the body follows the imagination without stress and strain, and becoming a personal expression. Uncle Nat, he probably knew more than any of us about the lore of African music. He said that spirituals, the basic music of Negro culture, were based upon recollections of African songs, and that the profane music of city Negroes was simply the familiar religious music put to swing. Well, I knew a considerable number of African songs, but when I went north, somehow I forgot them. And it was not until I began to meet native African musicians in Europe, many years later, that I was able to recall the old melodies laid away in the bottom drawers of my mind. The sacred words were dropped, and the new text, frequently meaningless, put the burden of sensation upon the notes. A gentleman by the name of Pete Vaugh, who conducted a seasonal singing school in the Flatwoods, used to stay at our house when he came to the village. He taught me to read book music. You know, those printed in square notes. Well, unfortunately, not too many memories of my pa. In 1898, when I was just 11, my father died. But up until then, music was all my life. Angel Mo. Oh, how I loved my Angel Mo. Also known as Mother Fanny. Mother Fanny believed in perfection. My mother was a small, slight woman, about 5 feet tall, and she moved rapidly as a bird. Her facial structure was both delicate and strong. And you could see from her sharp, keen eyes that she was able to penetrate a situation in an instant. My Angel Mo. Oh, how I loved my Angel Mo. Her skin was as smooth as olive. I recall in the fall of 1922, I received a letter from my mother in which she spoke for the first time of old age and the inevitability of death. I was deeply shocked to come upon these last words. She said, "Son, I feel good because the Lord let me have all the days He promised me. You must be glad for me and not feel sad when the Lord comes to take me away. But I stand ready to die. I stand ready to die anytime." My Angel Mo. Oh, how I loved my Angel Mo. Then I sailed from France in November to see her. I had hoped to persuade her to go back to Europe with me so that I could so that I could look after her during her last days. Oh, we had a wonderful visit together. Oh, she pleased me by showing an interest in my music. Mother was still deeply occupied with her work at home and in the church. And I was not surprised when she declined to go abroad with me. In spite of her failing health, she still did washing for many Negro boys and girls without a charge, if they were earning an education. She always gave them something to eat. She was very interested in their problems and gave them sound and difficult advice. But Mother was not impressed as much by my European trophies, contracts, programs, and jeweled presents from the king and queen. But she wept a little when I told her that I had song spirituals which she had taught me. On Monday morning after breakfast, I showed her the reviews. She read them in silence. She got up with a sigh from her chair, wiped her hands on her apron, and went out of the kitchen. She went out of the kitchen to get our midday dinner. In front of the steaming platters of Ma's good cooking, my mother reached out and patted my hand. She said, "Son, I see now what you've been trying to do. I'm not afraid for you anymore. I see that your feet are on the rock. Oh, son. Oh, son. I didn't feel nothing about your singing till yesterday. Everybody felt something holy then, and now I see it in the papers." Oh, how I loved my angel Mo. On January 25th, 1923, it was necessary for me to go back to England. I walked for the last time down the rickety stairs of the little frame house. I said, "Mother, do come with me. It's not too late. Will you promise me that you'll go with me next time I come back? I'll get you a fine house in Paris. Yes. Beautiful there." Ma placed her hands on my shoulders and looked at me with her worn eyes. Son, I won't be here when you come again. But that ain't nothing. My days are over, and yours are just begun. Oh, son, you can't do me no good when I'm dead. Oh, son, I never could do much myself, but I have always prayed. I've always prayed to the good Lord that I might do something good to some of my children. Son, you are young. You can do anything. God said, I call upon you because you're strong. Yes. Now you go on, okay? You ain't got no cause to worry about me. I'm all right. Just look. Just look. You see that? The whole church is round about my side. My angel Mo. Oh, how I loved my angel Mo. It must have been a bright and sunny morning. But I stumbled out of the house in darkness. I never saw my mother again. When I heard that my mother had died, my body ached here immediately in every nerve and fiber. All night I bruised. And then I comforted myself. I comforted myself with the repetition of my mother's well-remembered words. Son, you are the continuation of me. Remember who you are and give credit where credit is due. My angel Mo. Oh, how I loved my beloved angel Mo. I think I was about 6 6 years old when my mother and my aunt founded Mount Zion Baptist Church in the Flatwoods. And that church gave the Negroes their own spiritual home. We had neither prayer book, and the hymnal printed books were too dear. Prayers and scripture readings led at length up to the dramatic climax of the meeting, the pastor's sermon. You see, I absorbed it word by word and note by note, so much that I repeated it at home and in the fields. It became my duty to teach these biblical songs and folk arrangements. It was in this oral fashion that the spirituals were handed down amongst Negroes everywhere with hundreds of variations because texts were rarely written down. You see, every year I sing spirituals in my programs, and they nearly always came from the neighborhood of Curryville. Peter Weaver, the son of my great-grandfather Charles, grew up to be a fine, strong man. He married Mandy Mann. It was a Christian marriage. I am said to take after Peter. Peter and Grandma Mandy had 5 children. Fanny, Pony was my mother, they called her Pony, Aunt Harriet, Uncle Robert, my wife's father, Uncle Wilsty, and Uncle Simon, all of whom took the surname Mann after the liberation. Mother Fanny had been a pantry maid in the big house before her promotion to be lady's maid to Mrs. Mann. On immediate Sundays, the slaves would assemble in the cabin of one of their own pious fellow men and obtain little knowledge of reading. In my own mother's case, it was by means of her exchange of cookies for a daily report from her master's children on what they had learned that day. Ma worked hard all her life on the farm. She had no rest from labor. Well, except for going to church. My mother often told me, "The master, yes, one had to acknowledge him. I belonged to him. It was the law of the land. But what I am, here inside me, he couldn't touch." Only once, I remember seeing my mother cry. It was when my sister, her only daughter, Mattie, died. As for my pa, Ma seemed to take Pa's death more calmly. And, quite naturally, Ma was full of high hope for life eternal. Most of what I learned from my ancestors, I learned from the man who owned my mother. When I returned to Georgia in 1926 to purchase the farm where Ma had lived in slavery, I found the old gentleman in a sugar valley on the hills of Gordon County and the residence of the Mann family. He was obliged to sell the property which he had inherited from his father. As a boy, it was a palace. 2-storied, wide chimneys at either end, and across the full front of it, there stretched a veranda that was supported by 6 columns. And the bedrooms gave upon a canopied balcony with an elaborately embroidered railing. Ah, Victorian elegance. Well, Joe Mann came out to talk to me, and he spoke of Pony, my mother, his first wife's favorite slave. Hey, you've come a great family for singing. Do you remember that song your great-granddaddy made up? It was a song that went, "He never said a mumbling word." I told him, yes, I had sang that spiritual about the crucifixion in most of the capitals in Europe. And then I begged him to search his memory for other recollections of my great-grandfather Charles. My great-grandfather Charles, his African name was Aba Ugi. He was born a high chief. He was ambushed on the Ivory Coast and transported to Savannah and auctioned off to the Weaver family. 1790. Plantation owners were reluctant to allow their slaves to attend the camp meetings. You see, they were afraid that the missionaries would instruct them in the heresy of freedom. But the Negroes were determined to hear and would go secretly at night and sit at the feet of Christian teachers. My great-grandfather, he would continue to improvise musical signals with lyrics like, "Green trees are bending, Paulsena stands a trembling. A trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't got long to stay here." Great-grandfather, he became an overseer and counsel to the other slaves in order to prepare them against the day when God should give them their freedom. In secret, appointed meetings, he would whisper to his neighbor, "Steal away." And eventually, it was set to music, and a new spiritual was born. But the song by which my great-granddaddy is best remembered to this day is the story of Jesus and the cross. A tragedy which moved him because he too was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He never said a mumbling word. My Aunt Harriet Cross was my mother's own sister along with their brother Robert, for whom my brother was named likewise. She invited us all to come and stay with her in Chattanooga, Tennessee. My Uncle Robert had many children, and Alzada was one of them. We went out to the eastern outskirts of the city on Sunday to pay our visit to our cousins. that was the day I met my wife. My wife, who was born Alzada Man, remembers me in my first pair of fancy shoes. I was buddy to her. That's what she called me. Although she pretends that it was my shoes and not my person that impressed her then. Well, I remember I was 14 years old and my shoes were bright yellow. Down to the farm we had worn shoes only in the winter. In the late fall, after the cotton was sold, Ma used to buy brass-tipped brogans to keep our feet warm until spring. But many of our friends had no shoes at all. When I went to New York in 1931, I met up with Alzada. She was ill at the time, but I carried her off to Brookline, Massachusetts. I begged her to marry me. And I promised her that if she could put up with the necessity of my traveling, that I would lay everything I had at her feet. And now, since my mother's death, I was to find myself raised up by a woman's undistracted love. We got married in September about 1932. Our daughter, Africa Franzada, was born 2 years later. She is full of intuition and perceptions of her grandfather and inherits a good share of my mother's mysticism and practical sense.
I got a crown up in the kingdom, ain't that good news? Ain't that good news?
I joined a quartet called the Silver-Toned Quartet. Robert Eagle sang second tenor, my brother Robert sang the bass, Ben Ingram the baritone, and I sang the tenor voice. We soon graduated from the curbstone to the railway station, where we sang at the arrival and departure of the late evenings. In the summertime, we strolled up and down the avenues where rich people sat on their verandas to enjoy the night air, and we caught in our caps change that they shelled out to us over the hedges. I remember my teacher, Mrs. Cora Phillips, a motherly woman, and a friend to Mrs. Kennedy, the organist at the Monumental Baptist Church, that learned that I could sing and gave me an opportunity in the 8th grade commencement program. Her brother, Professor Calhoun from Oberlin, he heard me and he invited me for a walk with him and offered to coach me. I took 2 lessons a week, for which I paid 50 cents a lesson. Well, Ma thought I was wasting my money and hoped that I might be a preacher. I studied with Calhoun for more than 2 to 3 months before making a music career. Until I met Professor Calhoun, I had heard very little of white folks' music. After studying with him for a year, he invited me over to Mr. William Stone, the editor of the Chattanooga Times. You see, Mr. Stone, he was playing his phonograph, and it was then that I received my first intimation that singing is an art. I heard the distinguished music sung by Caruso, and my senses were awakened by Caruso's matchless tones. His tones opened the heavens for me, and that night I was determined to become an artist myself. The beauty of what could be done with a voice just overwhelmed me. Whew. But then, surprisingly, it was 20 years later that a Spanish critic spoke of me. They spoke of me as the Negro Caruso. In 1905, I had inquired about Fisk, Jubilee singers. They toured the United States and Great Britain to raise money for their school campus. I eventually got in. During my 3rd year at Fisk, I worked on the campus as a butler to Professor Warren G. Waterman, a Yankee chemist. During my 4th year, I lived in the men's dormitory, Livingston Hall, in which I had received free tuition, board, and lodging. At the end of my 4th year, after the terminal examinations, while I was in rehearsal with the Jubilee singers, Miss Robinson sent for me. I unfortunately had perhaps failed to do justice to my work in the Department of Music, and she had hoped I understood that I was being dismissed from the university. Overwhelmed with grief and disappointment, I went to see Professor Waterman, and I told him of the shock I had received. Some years later, I was in Mrs. Robinson's debt for what she had done for me. A hardly literate and untrained, impoverished boy. Well, she had given me a sound musical foundation and had seen to it that I had learned the rudiments of history, rhetoric, and the literature as well. Professor Calhoun had taught me some Schubert, note for note, coaching me on the vocal line until I could sing it without sustaining accompaniment. My taste for classical music gradually developed by singing the great oratorios, such as the St. Paul, Haydn's 7 Last Words, Elijah of Mendelssohn, and a few others. But when I left Nashville, I was not afraid of any work that might lie ahead of me. Besides, I was used to hard work and actually took comfort in it. From time to time, I had been asked to sing with the Jubilee singers, and they were preparing for a summer conference called The World in Boston. I signed up, but before I took the job in Boston, I went to Chattanooga to take leave of my mother. I promised her that I would come and fetch her and make a home for her up there. 8 years later, when I had sung all over the country in concerts I had managed myself, I asked a Boston manager if he could take over my bookings. He said, "Well, Hayes, you know that I'm your friend. I want to advise you as sensibly as I can. In my opinion, you have got about as far as you can get in this country. The American public will never cotton to you." In 1914, I came to Boston. Booker T. Washington was looking for a tenor who could sing duets with Negro composers and baritone Harry T. Burleigh. I was pleased with Dr. Washington when he chose me to travel in that distinguished company. I had not met him yet, but I had long since been familiar with the story of Burleigh's performance of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot for Antoine Dvorak, the Czech composer back in the 1890s. The melody of that spiritual appears slightly disguised as the second theme of the first movement of the New World Symphony. News of my public appearance with such great men as Booker T. Washington and Harry T. Burleigh filtered all the way back to Nashville. And in a letter of congratulation, my estranged teacher, Miss Robinson, suggested that it was time for us to bury the hatchet. When she died, she actually left me all of her teaching notes, and I took them to Paris. I am embarrassed to recall a time in Jordan Hall concert in Boston that in my preoccupation with the European composers and with learning French and German, I had become neglectful of Afro-American music. I was unconsciously putting myself into competition with white singers whose spotlight I wanted to share. I had not yet received the revelation which was presently to give my ambition its native direction. I had set out to become an artist, but I had still to learn that I must approach art personally. I had still to be taught that I, Roland Hayes, a Negro, had first to measure my racial inheritance and then to put it to use. It remained for me to learn, humbly at first, and then with mounting confidence, that my way to artistry was the Negro way. In 1918, I started out on a cross-country tour, which I managed myself. And then, in April of 1920, I sailed for England. My reputation was ultimately built upon hundreds of personal associations with people of high and low degree, rich and poor, musicians and writers, citymen and lords. I recall on April 23rd in 1921, only 2 days after my Wigmore Hall concert, I was with Lawrence Brown, my accompanist, and we were met at Buckingham Palace by the master of the household, who escorted us to an antechamber where he coached us in the manners and instructed us to rise and to make a deep bow. Well, anxiously awaited the entrance of the royal family, and the king spoke and said,
"There will be no formality today. I propose to meet with Mr. Hayes as man to man. Present Mr. Hayes to me, now."
Also in the company of the Queen, the Princess Mary, and the Duke of York. I hadn't expected to engage in conversation with the King and Queen, especially when he asked about the rift between the British and the American people. I said, "I'm afraid I'm deficient in history." However, the King stated that their English Quakers spoke against slavery in the American colonies. Queen Mary. She wanted more, and I told her that I was about to sing some traditional religious songs. I explained that scholars believed that some of the Negro music was about 150 years old, with biblical texts. Such composers as Harry T. Burleigh and J. Rosamond Johnson have spent their lives trying to recapture and preserve the original form and spirit of the songs in which our forebears created in the service of God. It was now my custom with these songs of the 17th and 18th centuries, performing Schubert, Wolf, and Brahms, that I concluded with a group of spirituals. In 1924, in fact, on the very evening of the presentation, I was singing again before the Queen of England in Lady Harcourt's house in Mayfair. I received the Springard Medal presented by Dr. Joseph H. Penniman, the president of the University of Pennsylvania. But in 1932, I received the first ever honorary Doctor of Music at Fisk University in the presence of Miss Robinson and Dr. Thomas Jesse Jones. In London and Paris, where I lived for 12 years, discussions of the music of African peoples in Africa and Afra-American folk music were mutually enlightening. Songs forgotten since childhood sprang to my lips, and to my astonishment, my native African audience joined in the music while expressing what they felt in their own language idiom. I observed that the Afra-American, having embraced and absorbed much of Western education, custom, and manner, it speaks over more extended phrases in his singing than the average African native has the habit of doing. Further, observation revealed that through the African and Afro-American song and dance forms are more or less identical, their manner and method of handling the rhythmic pulse and syncopation differed much. You see, they divide and subdivide all the great variety of rhythmic material they maneuver between the pulse points, and without the benefit of the tradition of his white brothers, created a form within his own soul and intelligence, drawing on his reservoir of musical instinct. From 1924 to 1930, I was able to take up my work in America, and I must say that there were many times when I needed all the resources and energy and enthusiasm I could store up. My recollections of my first official American tour are largely onomastic. I visited all of the places mentioned in Walt Whitman's poem, starting from Paumanok, and many more. I sang 3 or 4 times a week. I went to bed almost every night in a sleeping car, and I even woke up in one or another of 30 strange cities. Whew. But before the tour began, I appeared as soloist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra under the direction of Pierre Monteau. You see, I have always given something for everything I have received. I'm going all the time with countless invitations to sing all over the country. You know, for several years following, I was one of the few artists. I believe I'm right for saying this, but I was one of the few artists who could fill both Carnegie Hall and Symphony Hall 3 times every winter. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. The end of the age was coming in 1929. Bad news was revealed to me by a Wall Street prophet on board a ship heading to Paris. I was scolded for knowing so little about my investments. I was also advised by a gentleman to hurry back to Boston so that I might put my affairs in shape before the impending crash. I took his advice, but even so, I was too late to do myself much good. The October crash overtook me. After 1929, it seemed unlikely that I would be able to carry out a dream to use my money for a change to build Negro reputations. But still, I was unwilling to allow myself to be broken by disaster. I returned momentarily to my farm in Georgia. I could go there myself when life became too difficult. I had no doubt that the thought of home lent some new nostalgic quality to my singing of the Negro music. In American cities, which I visited for the first time, I often found the audiences inquisitive, skeptical, or even hostile. Yes, this happened to me in the West as well as in the East, including Tucson, Phoenix, Washington, D.C., and Baltimore. I recall in Tucson, when rooms were denied me, that I had only a few hours of rest after a sleepless night. I was on the point of canceling my concert when a well-disposed white citizen, he came to me with the hospitable offer of lodging in his own house. very kind of him. And, a Jim Crow scandal was stirred up all in the press, all the way from Los Angeles to New York. But I think it was on the second tour that a lady impresario, her name was Mrs. Green. She booked me for a concert in Baltimore and the other in Washington at Constitution Hall. Some of the daughters of the American Revolution, residents of the capital city, the Negroes called them Lily Whites. Well, they prevailed upon Mrs. Green to announce that white and colored patrons would sit in separate sections of the auditorium. Well, the Negro population protested the prospect of segregation, and Mrs. Green telephoned me in Boston asking me what to do. I said that I could not undertake to solve the problem for her, but at the same time, well, I wanted to be sure that some solution would have been reached long before I had left for the South. It was ultimately reported to me that black and whites were going to sit together in Washington, and the Negroes of Baltimore agreed to take a block of seats by themselves. However, when I arrived at the railway station in Baltimore, I was astonished to find a mob of shouting Negroes who looked as though they would tear me apart. They had heard that the tickets had been sold in Washington on equal terms and were inclined to blame me. I had to get some friends to conduct me to safety, to a barricaded chamber, and there I sat out the hour before the concert. The hall was packed. The outside crowd kept the building practically in a state of siege. I said, "Listen, I cannot sing in the midst of this confusion." Mrs. Green persuaded me to make my entrance. That is when I decided to make a speech at the front of the platform. People, I may not be able to finish my program, and if I don't, you will all know why. And that's when I opened my program with a crucifixion, because that's how I felt. I recall a time about 1935 when I was invited to sing at the dedication of the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial to represent the Negro race. Booker T. Washington was his guest for lunch at the White House. But perhaps of more significance to me was a quotation which appeared in the president's address. And it read, "A great democracy must be progressive, or it will soon cease to be either great or democratic." And I thought of the 15 million Americans of my color. patiently waiting for democracy to come along. The Negro problem to white people means, what are we going to do with those Negroes? And to us, it means something else. It means, how can we advance ourselves in a social and political order of which we are the voiceless 10%? I believe we possess many rich qualities in our own country, and I wish we could learn to treasure them. Well, I have no doubt that some of my people will think I have understated my private vexations. You see, stones have been thrown through the windows of my house, and I have been refused a bed, a chair, a meal in a restaurant, and not so long ago, I was beaten and thrown into jail. Although some of us have got into trouble and had to pay with the grass rope and the hickory tree, we are naturally a gentle and imaginative people. When you come to know us, finally, I was under professional management at last. The news of my success in Europe had reached my native shores. You see, Bach used to be the most difficult of composers to listen to. But when I had trained myself to hear his music with the whole man, I was satisfied that I had become a musician myself. The study of counterpoint taught me to think of the melody of a song and its background as one piece of musical material, and to use my voice as though it were an instrument, as though I was bowing a violin. Bach. Well, I remember an interesting comment that Dr. Lehrhammer made when I sang for him Bist du bei mir and Steal Away while in Vienna. He said he was surprised to find how much the Negro spirituals and the music of Bach had in common. Well, you see, they both seem to call for the same treatment of the vocal line and the same religious approach. For example, the motion is constant, even in sostenuto passages. It pleases me to believe that I was restoring the music of my race to the serious atmosphere of its origin and helping to redeem it for the national culture. I recall in an interview before this concert, yes, October 27th, 1946, a 30th anniversary recital was given at Boston Symphony Hall. And I said, I'm doing different now. You see, years before the Depression, people used to come to me. Well, today, I go to them, and I go everywhere. There's no hall or audience too small. Wherever I chance to go, I keep my standards. And one thing I've always known is that a thorough preparation is more important than voice. You see, long before I won the position I wanted on the stage, I accepted knowledge from all sides. And in another interview in November 1946, while on the cross-country tour for 6 months, you see, I always sing my heart out. Whether the audience is large or small, I never know who's in that audience. Besides, if I didn't give my best all the time, I wouldn't have stayed up on top for 30 years. Of course, the more I am able to encourage by example, and otherwise, the young boys and girls who are coming up after me, the quicker this lesson will have gotten abroad. Yes, finally, someone must pioneer the way to encounter this discouragement, and I, as well as others of my race, am trying to do that as cheerfully as possible.